All right, so it appears that we are ready to start. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Then let me say welcome to the first event of the relaunched Minerva Academy of Lifelong Learning, which Dr. Sophia Din, who's off camera right now, has been working very hard for a month to get together. And it's really wonderful to be able to start doing events on this new platform. For 10 seconds, I'm just going to say, keep your eyes out for new emails from us. We're going to be doing a number of things that are designed to be lifelong learning events, meaning that these are not for specialists. These are not meant to pitch to the people who are already in a discipline or already enmeshed in a particular literature, but as opposed to that, meant to be open and interesting to a broad audience. And so it gives me also great pleasure to have Andy Rosenthal joining me for this event. And to the extent that he needs an introduction, very briefly, Andy was, among other things, a reporter in Moscow during critical years in the late 1980s, and then the bureau chief for the AP. Tell me if I get anything wrong, Andy. Then with the New York Times for a long time, where he was a national editor, an opinion editor, as well as a reporter. He has deep knowledge, I believe, of contemporary politics, quite generally speaking, and particularly of what's happening in Russia and the Ukraine right now, which is the focus for our discussion today. And so Andy and I tried to collect a few questions in advance, which we're going to start making our way through. But we see this as being an opportunity for an interactive event. And so I hope that there will be questions coming into us as well. And as those questions come in, we'll break out of our dialogue and be in dialogue with you. So we organized 8 kinds of questions, right? And as you can see, an overview, some historical context, some effort to understand Putin, some effort to understand what's happening with the Ukrainian military and their apparent military and political success, the conduct of NATO and the West as a whole, how badly damaged Russia is from all of this, the ascendancy of autocracy is a more general theme, and whether or not this is perhaps the emergence of a new Cold War, and that feeds nicely into our final theme, the broader global implications of all this. And as you will see in just a moment, we have multiple questions under each of those rubrics. So starting with the overview, what is the current state of play in the war? And this is, I guess, the point where Andy and I get to start having our conversation. So, Andy, do you want to take a first stab at this?
Sure. I mean, obviously, it's a stalemate right now. The Ukrainians have done better than anybody thought they would do. Then the Russians have done worse than people thought they would do. But that's an interesting topic we can talk about. Russia has gotten some of what it wanted already. It's de facto controlling the southern land route to Crimea. It's getting more territory in Donbass in eastern Ukraine, where all of the minerals and the factories are. And he has also wreaked havoc in Europe. The GDPs of every European country for the next 20 years are going to be tied up in rebuilding Ukraine. And he's also wreaked havoc on the whole refugee situation in Europe. I mean, he's really caused a lot of harm already. And it's hard to figure out a win-lose here. I just don't, I don't see it particularly. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I'm going to start with a little bit more information. And so I think I think what you just said is very illuminating. The map here, right, from March 2nd shows the full, broad blitzkrieg onslaught with which this war began, right? This is about 10 days into the war, where the Russians are moving on Kyiv, Kharkiv, as well as the Donbass, and trying to make their way to Odessa, right? And so you could kind of draw that line from Kyiv to Odessa, which if you look at the overall map is more than half of the Ukraine. That appears to be what the Russian ambition was, right? To topple the Zelensky government. And from that perspective, it is remarkable how badly this campaign has failed. But what you point out is actually maybe it's still a really important success for Putin, because although he doesn't have half or more of the Ukraine, although the fighting is now really concentrated in the Donbass, and these two maps show both where the Ukrainians have recently pushed the Russians back out of Kharkiv and where the Russians are trying to advance. And it seems increasingly a war of attrition, an artillery war, a war that is going to be bloody and awful and incredibly destructive for any civilians left in the territory. It is a much more confined theater of conflict than the Russians apparently first aimed for. But having said that, if the real point here is to establish that land bridge to the Crimea, to grab those precious minerals that are in the earth in the Donbass, and to upend the post-Cold War European political order, then maybe this war is much more of a success in its broader implications, despite the humiliating losses on the ground for the Russians. That's my initial take.
I think you're right. I mean, the word success is a kind of a funny word in this context. You know, he has achieved some of his objectives. I mean, you look at that thing, Luhansk, Donetsk, Mariupol, and over to Crimea, that is the land bridge that the Russians have wanted forever, ever since Khrushchev gave Crimea to Ukraine.
Right, and it gives them Black Sea access, it gives them minerals, it gives them some sort of claim to the areas that are ethnically, linguistically, historically closer to the Russians. And the other interesting thing about all this is it has adamantly produced Ukrainian nationalism, patriotism, anti-Russian hatred, even in most of the population in the eastern Ukraine, right? And so it's one thing to take it, it's another thing to hold it, right? And we'll get into this, but among other things, it appears that it has also mobilized around 1 million Ukrainian men who are now willing to fight and die for their country in what was essentially a decade ago a demilitarized society.
It is extraordinary how quickly it's happened. And I think what it shows us is, you know, you can think of this as East versus West. You can think of this as democracy versus autocracy. You can think of it as whatever you want. But what is really going on here is that the one thing that all of these people have in common, even in Belarus, but they're a friendly government, is they all hate the Russians. And the Ukrainians despise the Russians almost more than anybody else, except maybe the Poles. And this is about Russia. It's not about NATO, for them, I'm talking about. It's not about NATO, it's not about democracy, it's about the Russians. And this has been going on for hundreds of years. Those borders in Eastern Europe are fictitious. They were invented by outsiders who had no business doing it. If you look at the map of Ukraine, the sovereign Ukraine, which has existed now for 31 years? Is that right? I think so.
I'm not doing the math, but I trust you.
1991. Let's just take 1991. Right. So there was no sovereign Ukraine before 1991. It just did not exist. And those borders, if you look at them, they were drawn by Hitler and Stalin in 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland. And Stalin was his ally, and he gave parts of Poland to Stalin, and he added them to the Ukrainian SSSR, right? And if you look at this, if you go back a second,
sorry, go ahead.
Town over here, Lviv, that town was Lvov for a long time. It's Polish, right? Kharkiv was Kharkov. these are all Ukrainianizations of towns that belong to other places. And look, it is a sovereign nation right now, right? The world agreed on that in 1991. Okay, they were admitted to the UN, everything else happened. But the complexity of this is staggering, and we know we're going to talk about that later. You've got to go back hundreds of years to understand this thing.
And I was starting to go forward to look at that. I was going to tell you what you're saying prompted three little vignettes for me. The first is that my grandmother was born in Warsaw, Russia, right? So right. We got to recognize that these borders shift. The second is this old Ukrainian saying that when Ukrainians begin to have culture, they do so in Russian, right? And so driving the Ukrainians away from Russia is something of an accomplishment, right? And of course, Stalin has something to do with that, as well as Putin. The third is going to Czechoslovakia in 1991 and not speaking, it was then Czechoslovakia, not speaking any Czech. When I was in Prague, I started to try out Russian, and the person I was speaking with spat at my feet, right? Because they were so offended. They spoke Russian perfectly.
They all speak Russian.
They were unwilling to engage the language of the colonial oppressor, right?
And you can understand that, right? I mean, it makes a lot of sense. We have a very nice woman named Christina who cleans our house, and she's Polish and she speaks fluent Russian, but she just said to me, I just will not speak Russian to you. Mm-hmm. So sometimes I speak to her, she doesn't understand me, but the hatred of Russia and this rivalry is intense. And remember, we haven't even talked about the Russians yet and their attitude toward all this. I mean, we're going to get to that.
Well, let's push on because
also, by the way, the capital of Imperial Poland 500 years ago or whatever it was Kiev.
Right. When Poland was an empire, right? Which was
a long time ago, and it didn't last very long. There was Khanate and there was all this other stuff in there.
So I just want to, we've really focused on the military strategic dimension of the state of the campaign. I want to bring in a few other aspects to this as well, sure. Right? And so just looking at the devastation of the Ukrainian cities, right? And the indiscriminate destruction of civilian targets with absolutely no military value. This is a return to an archaic, barbaric kind of warfare in which the Russians are simply trying to get submission by showing overwhelming military superiority. And they have failed doubly in this, right? They don't have overwhelming military superiority. And as opposed to cowing the Ukrainians, they've motivated and mobilized the Ukrainians into resistance. That does not diminish the awfulness on the ground, right? I think this is Mariupol that we're seeing.
Can I just push back on the word indiscriminate for a second?
Yeah.
We don't know that. For all we know, they're deliberately targeting civilians.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough.
Right? And look, it's not the first time this has happened. It's not the last time this has happened. The United States has done this too, but that's not what the conversation's about right now. It's about what's happening in Ukraine right now, and the style of warfare that Russia is using is the kind that the European countries have normally reserved for Africa and the Middle East.
Right.
Now they're doing it in their own home, which is amazing, right?
And most recently by the Russians, Aleppo.
Aleppo, yes.
And then we could go back to Georgia. But so this is clearly, when I say indiscriminate, or what I mean is that they don't differentiate.
They do not.
From military target, or else they consider civilian targets to be legitimate military targets. Now,
right, what we're seeing about the killing of people on the ground is true, and it certainly appears to be, right? There's nothing to contradict it, and we've seen it with our own eyes. That's also part of what you're talking about. It's basically terrorism, right? You just go out in the street, you start shooting people.
And this is Busha, right? The suburbs of Kyiv, where on the one hand, they shoot people in their front yard. On the other hand, it appears there are summary executions of civilians with their hands tied behind the back, rape, torture, etc. Right? And again, just putting as human a face on the barbarism, the brutality of this, the way in which the Russians are conducting this war. Again, we have to be careful. It's probably the case. It is almost always the case in war that there's brutality and criminality on both sides, right? But I think that there's a clear asymmetry here. Not only is Russia the aggressor, Russia is using terror and criminality as an instrument of war.
Correct. Not for the first time, but yes.
Yeah, yeah. And then just very quickly, the extent of the refugee crisis this has generated. Andy, you're emphasizing the kind of long-term impact on Europe, the short-term impact, which has diminished now that Russia has withdrawn to the east and the south and is concentrating on a narrower theater. But, you know, putting 2+ million refugees into Poland, right, completely overwhelming the European infrastructure for handling refugees. And at the same time,
which by the way is completely broken.
Right.
I mean, maybe we'll talk about that later, but what this thing highlights is how deeply the European system does not work. And I think that's important for us to keep in mind. I mean, how many millions of refugees were already in Europe living in essentially in concentration camps with darker skin and who don't speak a Slavic language, right? Millions. And I'm not doing the what about here, although it's easy to do, but the refugee situation in Europe is at a critical point. You take a country like Sweden, which is just now trying to join NATO, right? They went from 8 million to 12 million in a very short period of time. All of those people are refugees. And there's lots of countries like that. These countries like Poland opened its borders to the Ukrainians, but has closed its borders to everybody else, right? So you have this refugee crisis that's going on from Ukraine, which is real and incredibly important, but it's sitting on top of an existing refugee crisis that is already draining European resources and undermining the EU's cohesion and everything else. So,
yeah, I'm thinking back to something Thomas Friedman said a few years ago, which is that the best way to divide the world right now is simply between the ordered and the disordered. And that everybody who is in the disordered portions of the world wants to get into the more orderly portions of the world. And frankly, Europe is the clearest destination, right? And this is just going to get worse if we have more warfare or when climate change starts to displace more and more people.
I think it was Isaac Asimov who postulated the world would come to an end in a nuclear war over water between Sri Lanka and India.
Yes. Let's get into that historical context for a moment, and I'm going to mainly defer to you on this, Andy. How far back do we need to go? And you can see we've got Vladimir the Great, we've got Yalta. And I happen to really like this image of, Clinton and Putin. I think it speaks volumes, just in the body language about the way in which Putin perceived the situation in 1991. Why don't you take us away on that topic, please?
All right. So, I mean, we can go back to the 14th century or the 10th century or whatever we want to do. I mean, but generally you have hundreds of years of all these borders changing constantly. No real national identity in Europe at this point. It's mostly it's kind of tribal, right? And they start to consolidate in some cases. But what really happens is other powers start to draw these borders. I mean, the Yalta thing there, is that Yalta?
That is Yalta, yeah.
Okay, that's where the West gave Eastern Europe to Stalin.
Right.
And we created all of these countries. Now, they happened at different times, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, which were not countries. There was, they were called that, but they weren't. And all of this was held together by Soviet military power and the fear of the KGB and of the Russian army, right? And Gorbachev, who I admire in many ways, was like the last true believer. He believed that you could have democracy and communism at the same time. He was clearly wrong. And the second they lifted the lid on this pressure cooker, it just exploded. And Russia has managed to hold on to some of these countries, and it has invaded others like Georgia. But if you look at the countries that emerged from the Soviet Empire, very few of them are really functioning democracies. And none of them had real borders, right? So Yugoslavia breaks up. Czechoslovakia breaks up. And the only reason that Czechoslovakia was even where it was because the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968 to put down its democratic urges, and the West did nothing. And this is all part of the history. So Russia also invades Hungary in 1956 for the same reason. I mean, tanks on the ground, and the West did nothing.
I'll just add very quickly that one apparent line of thinking within the Kremlin is that invading the Ukraine would be a lot like invading Hungary, that they would just be overwhelmed by the sheer might of the Russian military and immediately back down and recognize their big brother had arrived and was ready to take charge.
Which didn't happen, because I think the Russians underestimated the degree to which Ukraine has become a nation. And not since 1991 even, but a lot more recently, since Maidan, basically. And it's interesting, if you look at some of the...
Call that out for a second, right? The Dignity Revolution, the Orange Revolution.
Right. All of these things.
Right.
And what they did was create nationality that didn't exist before. The Russians in Eastern Ukraine, when it was part of the Soviet Union, whether they thought themselves as Russian or Ukrainian, it's kind of irrelevant anyway, because the Russians were governing them, right? And after this happened, you develop these intense, and specifically in Ukraine, the peaceful revolution in Ukraine, semi-peaceful, was all about moving away from the Russian context. Right. And I think the Russians underestimated the degree to which the people who have lived in Ukraine, who speak Russian, who maybe have relatives in Russia and are ethnically Russian, whatever in God's name that means. I don't think it has any real meaning. They consider themselves Ukrainian, and the Russians did not get that. And I think they were shocked when they came in, that in such a short period of time, the sheep had started to arm themselves.
And I guess I want to say a little bit more about this in terms of the blindness of an autocratic society.
Yes.
The way in which things change in a society that has an intact civil society, right? And I don't want to suggest that the Ukraine was a model democracy or a fully free society or didn't have any problems, but part of what it had was an experiment with some opening that allowed people to begin to shape their own horizontal connections with each other, right? An autocratic society is a top-down society in which essentially you look up for anything you want. The Ukrainians began to build those one-on-one, person-to-person relationships in civil society. And as they began to do so, they began to see the advantages of that kind of freedom and to shape their own identities a little bit more organically, a little bit more spontaneously. And so they were not looking to return to the old model of vertical integration. And that if you're in that vertical society, sometimes it's really hard to even understand that the other society now has a different mode of social organization to it.
Right. I think, life in Ukraine may not be wonderful, but life in Russia just sucks. Right. And they know that. And also going back to Russia doesn't just mean, rejoining their Russian-speaking relatives and, having better pelmenis or whatever it is that, the Russians do. It means going back to living under the autocracy of the KGB. Sorry, the FSB.
Yes.
And they don't want that. They don't want the idea. Americans are kind of foolish about all of this. This is not about people becoming, God help me, Jeffersonian democracies, which has its gigantic flaws. This is about ancient hatreds and rivalries. And, we should talk about how the Russians view this too, because we talk about framing the context. The most important event in modern Russian history was the Second World War. I think everybody knows that, right? I was there for the I guess it was the 40th anniversary, and it was incredible, and it was the only time that Russia shined, that it was united. Their losses were unbelievable, and they used those losses to mask the same exact number of losses that they suffered at the hands of Stalin, right? So just as many people were killed inside Russia as were killed in the war, right? But they hang on to this thing, and it means an incredible amount to them. And there's several things about World War II that the Russians firmly believe, and about the aftermath of it. One is that they believe that the United States and England delayed the opening of the Second Front for a year in order to diminish Stalin's army. Yes, Hitler's army too, but the costs of that were incredible, right? And they're not wrong. They're not wrong. They also think that after the war, the United States created an alliance that was designed to hem them in and reduce their power and ultimately destroy the communist system, NATO. They're also not wrong about that. They're not right, but they're not wrong. They believe that the West, particularly the United States, sneers at them and looks down on them and thinks of them as not a real country, and they're not wrong. We do. So the level of paranoia and the level of resentment in Russia is staggering, especially among people that are people my age. It's incredible, right? 66, but people even in their 40s, people who were born in the Soviet Union, and the Russians are just as proud of their nationality as the Ukrainians are, right?
Can I? Were you done, or do you have?
No, I'm done. So that's why Putin's propaganda is so effective, because people already believe it.
So let me jump in on this, and just I completely agree with what you're saying. I want to push it forward a little bit, because on the one hand, right, the ultimate victory over Hitler and the tremendous costs, right? I mean, it's the millions, right? If I remember correctly, the Soviet Union did not have state services for men born in, and I think it was like 1921 to 1923, because all of those men were dead, right? They died in the war, right? So the tremendous cost of winning the war, of repelling Stalin, but then Russia emerges as a superpower, right? And really, for the first time in its history, its geopolitical influence matches its self-understanding, right? It thinks of itself as this territorially great power that deserves an empire, and lo and behold, it emerges from the ashes of World War II as that kind of empire. And then if we fast forward, and that's why I like this image of Clinton and Putin, to the early 1990s, right? After Yeltsin, right, cedes power to Putin, there's this huge economic collapse in Russia, and it's forced to devalue the ruble, to beg Europe for food aid, and the war breaks out in the former Yugoslavia, and NATO declares a no-fly zone and makes the Serbs essentially the first international criminals under the newly emerging world order, right? And I think this is experienced, especially by Putin, but by so many Russians, as deep national humiliation, right?
Yes.
And so the idea that Putin rescues Russia from this steep decline that accompanies the end of the Soviet Union, from being one of the two global superpowers to being this powerless society that can't even protect the Serbs, or sustain its own currency, or feed its own people, is tremendously important to Putin's eventual rise. It's another reason why people buy Putin's propaganda to the extent that they do.
I agree. One of the central points of his propaganda is that this is an anti-Nazi operation.
Right.
And we should look at where that comes from. Okay, so when we talk about Western Ukraine, after World War II, Western Ukraine, there was a lot of these militias, like the Azov battalion that you've all heard about, grew out of neo-Nazi or Nazi groups after World War II. And Western Ukraine was heavily influenced by this. There was a man named Stepan Bandera, and it's easy to remember because he's not Antonio Banderas, it's Stepan Bandera. He was a Nazi, and they issue stamps in his name. They have statues to him in every Ukrainian city. They issued a commemorative stamp on his 100th anniversary of his birthday while Zelensky was in office. And he has refused repeatedly to renounce this. Okay, does that make Ukraine Nazi? You know, this conversation would go on for 5 hours, right? Like, you know, does the fact that we had slavery in the United States make us all racist? It's just not a conversation that's worth having right now. But the Russians know about this and they believe it. And also, let's remember that Ukraine, I am not pro-Russian. You know, I cannot stand the Russians. I lived there for 4 years. It's a horrible place. But Ukraine is not a model democracy. It never was. And under Zelensky, yeah, they no longer put people in jail for being gay, but they have no rights. They do not recognize transgenderism. They don't recognize all of the things that we think are hallmarks of an inclusive society. It is not an inclusive society. Does that mean we shouldn't protect it? No, because it is a sovereign nation. And this business.
The other thing to recognize here is that imperfectly and, you know, in a totally incomplete way, Zelensky was trying to pivot the Ukraine to the West, right? And whether that's
Russia, whatever that means.
Well, but joining the European Union, right? Clearly, right?
Joining the European Union, that's big.
There's some preconditions to that, and so we again, you know, it's so hard. There's so many moving pieces to pull them all apart. But that part of what is motivating Putin in this invasion, and I'm inclined to view this not as purely an opportunistic campaign, but in a sense, a war of necessity for Putin. And I guess I think of this in two ways. The first is that having a society that is a neighboring society, that is a very similar society, moving very clearly in the direction of the West, right? And imperfectly, incompletely, but nevertheless moving in that direction where, right, Russians go to vacation, where they have relatives, etc., represents a major threat to Putin maintaining the authoritarian rule that he spent a couple decades consolidating. And then the second thing here, and again, I think this is really for later in the conversation, but the idea that Putin, and this is true, I think, of so many authoritarian leaders, needs crises, right? You need a strong leader to respond to a crisis. And so this goes all the way back to Hannah Arendt and the origins of totalitarianism. Authoritarian leaders tend to manufacture crises when they don't occur, right? And so part of what's going on here in painting the Ukraine to be ruled by Nazi thugs is finding a crisis. Similarly, in viewing NATO as potentially aggressive, I'm inclined to view it that way as well.
I'm not sure that that's insane, but okay. This idea that NATO is a purely defensive alliance, you know, I just don't buy it. I mean, the purpose of NATO is to contain and destabilize and ultimately change Russia, you know, the communists, right? And I don't think it's like the Warsaw Pact, but it's you know, and when Ukraine and Georgia said they wanted to join NATO, and NATO said they would consider it. I'm not defending this invasion, but it became almost inevitable at that point. Russia invaded Georgia instantaneously, right? In weeks, and succeeded, and all they got was whining from the West. So the invasion of Ukraine was not an illogical next step. I'm not saying it's justified, and I'm not saying it's good for the world, but it kind of makes sense, you know. And now in the middle of all this, we're now considering Sweden and Finland as members of NATO.
So I do have, let us see, and obviously I have a lot of material here. A map, let's see where it is, if I can find it. Yeah, here we go. So this is, the map of NATO member countries, right? And if you were just to look at this map, and then you add Finland and Sweden, and think about it just in terms of like a game board, right? You know, where are the pieces? It's looking more and more like Russia is encircled on its large western border, right?
And southern border, so I mean southwestern border.
Right, and of course there is a long history of invasions coming from the West, going back, you know, further than Napoleon. But having said all of that, I think if you actually look at the military capabilities of NATO, especially prior to Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, they're not offensive capabilities, right? This is not the kind of military you would assemble if you were trying to invade another country, right?
I believe that to be true. I don't know it for sure, but yeah, I believe that's correct.
Yes, and I assume I think that is true, and I assume the generals around Putin know this to be true, right? And that doesn't mean that Putin listens to those generals. That doesn't mean that those generals are confident enough to be honest in what they say to Putin, right? I think that we have to suspend belief about all of that. But at least from, I think, an objective military perspective, yes, NATO is expanding. Yes, it looks increasingly like Russia is surrounded in the West and the South by countries that are committed to defending themselves against them and containing them. But having said that, I don't think that makes this an aggressive pact. Let's go back, but let's.
I just don't think it's really defensive either. But it's, you know, that's not the point here. I think you're absolutely right. But you look at that map, and if you're Putin, what do you see? You see a giant wall that's being built to hold your country in. Okay, keep going.
So let's talk more about Putin. That's our next set of questions. And so again, I'll let you run lead on this. Can we make sense of him? Is he rational, or what else is motivating him? Is it some messianic vision of greater Russia, or some form of religious mysticism, or is it purely strategic action?
I don't think it's religious mysticism. I think it's certainly a form, a vision of a greater Russia. I think it's hard to answer this question because, first of all, our information about Putin right now is almost zero. We have a lot of articles in the newspaper speculating about this and that and the other thing, but they're not based on any real sourcing. I've never seen it. Maybe I've missed it, but I've never seen an article quoting actual sources in the Russian government about what's going on with Putin, right? It's, you know, they're quoting diplomats in, you know, Finland. And okay, fine, that's how you do it. I mean, covering that country is a nightmare. So rational. If you live in an irrational world, then rational becomes something else, right? I think he's behaving rationally within his context. A lot of people that I respect, including a very dear colleague of mine I was just talking to about this. I was in Moscow with her in the 80s. She thinks he's lost it, that he's crazy. You have to start from the fact that everybody who thinks they should be the president of a country is crazy. That's just a fact, right? So they're all nuts. Biden's nuts, Clinton's nuts, they're all crazy. But so leaving that aside, is he behaving like psychotically? Is he out of control? We don't really know. And I just, he's really inscrutable. You know, I mean, this guy was born in the KGB. And when we liked him, which was a long time ago, the West used to say, yeah, he was in the KGB, but he was in the external portion of the KGB. No, he wasn't. He was in East Germany. The Soviet Union did not consider East Germany to be a separate country. Okay. So he was part of the oppressive, and he is following that playbook, right? Appealing to Russian nationalism, shutting down all sources of information, making sure that the people in his country have no idea what's going on outside, right? And that includes him. He certainly appears crazy by our standards. Well, if you don't count Donald Trump. But I just don't know. And I worry about assuming that he's nuts, because I don't know what that gets us. You know, what advantage do we gain from that? What how does that help us understand a way out of this? And I think he is a little messianic. I think that's absolutely true. Otherwise, why do you pose in public with your shirt off on a horse? I mean, you have to be nuts to do that, right?
Apparently that image doesn't circulate in Russia, from what
Well,
I've
it doesn't, because they would think he was a moron. And they don't ride horses and they don't take their shirts off. And by the way, you want to see something, anybody who's listening to this, Google Putin Blueberry Hill. Don't do it now. But you will see a video on YouTube of Vladimir Putin singing Blueberry Hill at an event that included a whole host of has-been and never were movie stars from the West, including Goldie Hawn and her husband and other people. It's absolutely hilarious, but watch it and understand it's not a joke.
Okay. Well, okay. So we've gone from messianic to just a mess. But
well, I think he is a mess. But how does that help Biden? How does that help Zelensky? You know, how does that?
And look, you know, whatever else we want to say about Vladimir Putin, he is sitting on the world's largest arsenal of nuclear weapons, right? And so it behooves us to understand what motivates him. And I think among the other things we got to pay attention to is that he waits till Angela Merkel is out of Germany. He waits until the price per barrel of oil is at its highest. He waits until in the aftermath of a really terrible election, the US appears to be very weak and disunified, thanks in part to some Russian meddling. He waits until the second year of a global pandemic, right? He doesn't seem to be unhinged. He seems to have some strategic acumen. Having said all of that, that doesn't mean he's a modern international relations theorist who just thinks about state action in a purely narrowly rational strategic point of view. And what you said about Mother Russia, about Greater Russia, and I think it is in certain respects messianic, at least I think we have to take seriously when he refers to some of the mystical religious figures he says have influenced him, that this idea that God has abandoned the world because Greater Mother Russia is sick. You know, I don't know how much of that is purely propaganda, but it certainly seems to be one of the elements in his strategy or his thinking. And it behooves us to figure out as many different ways as we can to get inside his inscrutable head. If we are going to continue escalating this war, which is what we are doing.
Well, that's what we are doing. Yeah, you know, when I lived in the Soviet Union in the 80s and a long time after that, they always referred to it as the motherland. And one year during his New Year's address, I saw an article saying that Putin had referred to it as the fatherland, and they avoided the fatherland because that was so Nazi and German, right? The Russians hate the Germans. Don't underestimate that. And so I looked it up and I watched his speech in Russian, and he did. He said Otechество, which is fatherland. Mm-hmm. And that may seem like a small thing, but it's not. It's just a symbol of how central that flag behind him and the idea that he is Peter the Great is to Putin.
Do you know who the sculpture is here? That's Ivan the Terrible.
Oh, God.
And so for the first time in Russian history, there's a sculpture to Ivan the Terrible in Moscow that Putin had constructed. And I think this just gives us a little window into his conduct, right? In that, you know, this is the giant table that he sits at, the 20-foot long table that he makes everybody sit at the opposite end of. And in that room, apparently the only statues are Ivan the Terrible, Catherine the Great, and Stalin. And Putin.
Stalin?
Yeah. Putin considers Stalin not as a Soviet leader, but as a consolidator of Russian empire. And he considers himself to be the fourth great Russian leader in that line, right? You know, never Peter the Great because he was too Western, right? But Ivan the Terrible, Catherine the Great, and Stalin add Putin, and you've got your pantheon of great Russian leaders.
That's how I think that's a good theory. Yes, I mean, that probably is true about how he sees himself. By the way, about the big tables and the grand rooms, the Russians always did that. You know, it was a substitute for actual importance. Yeah. But Putin does it to a point of insanity, you know, and
so I'm being told we've got 5 more minutes, and I think we just got started. So why don't we
have like 10 questions on
and we've got some questions on social media. So
I wanted to make one more point.
Yeah, go ahead.
After Yalta, Russia emerged as the new superpower, and Russia believed that the United States and Britain agreed with that Russia was in fact a new superpower, and discovered that we did not actually agree with that.
Right.
And after the Soviet Union fell apart, we declared another new world order, and we all agreed on it, but we forgot to send a memo to Moscow.
Yeah.
And they have never agreed to any of this stuff, ever. And I'm not saying that they get a veto, but all of these notions of the new world order are Western.
And,
they have nothing to do with Russia.
It's worthwhile noting, you know, when you look at the UN vote to condemn Russian aggression in the Ukraine, it looks lopsided. 160 nations voting to condemn, 30 nations abstaining, 7 nations voting against the motion. But if you add up the population of the nations abstaining, it's the vast majority of the world's population, because it's China and it's India and it's Brazil, right? And I think that speaks not only to the fact that Moscow didn't get the memo, but a lot of the rest of the world did not particularly like our new world order, right?
China definitely did not. And India wasn't so crazy about it either. And don't forget that India and Russia have been friends for a long time. The Soviet Union and India had really good relations.
I was going to call your attention to this quote from Putin from the speech on the 21st of February, 3 days before the invasion. He says, Ukraine is an inalienable part of our own history, cultural and spiritual space. Modern Ukraine was entirely created by modern Bolshevik Russia. No political factors can or may be used as the fundamental principles of statehood. It's a really peculiar, really interesting quote. If he believes this, it makes him a deeply, I would say, anti-modern politician.
I agree with you. Is it entirely untrue that Ukraine was created by Bolshevik Russia?
No. Well,
it's also irrelevant. It's irrelevant, you know. But this is I'd love to. I got to go back and find this in its original Russian, because some of the language is strange there. But I think that quote is unbelievably important, which is why you picked it.
And the question is, could you not say this about any nation in the world today, in part, right? That they are historically, you can do a genealogy that shows you how they emerged, and it's not going to be a natural organic process. All of our countries are created through political artifice. That doesn't mean we don't respect their territory, their borders, their treaties, their governments, right?
When we choose to, David. I don't want to, look, I don't want to compare Russia to the United States, but the United States is not blameless in this, not in Ukraine, but I mean, we have done a lot of really crappy stuff, including bombing.
In a couple minutes, that's exactly where I want to take us. And so I put John Mersheimer here, who's for some reason dressed as Machiavelli, don't ask me why. And he is, right, the person who has this, Russia invaded Ukraine because of NATO expansion theory. It's most associated with him. As I've already said, I don't buy that theory, but that doesn't mean NATO or the United States are blameless. Let's talk a little bit about how they responded to the Ukrainian and the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, and whether or not the response of the West is in fact escalatory. You want to jump in on that?
Well, I'd like to know your opinion about that. I think it is. I mean, we have expanded. There was I hate to say this because I'm no longer there, but there was a pretty good editorial in the New York Times today about what exactly are our goals here. What is it that let's not say we anymore because it's not us, but what is it the United States and the EU want out of this? What is it that they're trying to do? Are they seeing this as the golden opportunity to finally undermine the Russian Empire? Because that's certainly what Putin says. And, there's some evidence that, maybe that's not false, right? A lot of the rhetoric coming out of the West is bizarre, in my mind. I think the propaganda coming out of the West is problematic. The American media has seized on it wholeheartedly, and it bothers me. But I don't know, because every day there's something else. And now we're talking to Sweden and Finland in the middle of all this.
And so I
understand it. I just don't understand it.
Short answer to your question would be to punish Putin and Russia, to deter future aggression from other would-be autocratic aggressors, and to reassert the hegemony of that neoliberal political order. But I would also suggest—
let's not forget that when Russia seized Ukraine, all of those people said it was perfectly okay. Who rose up to stop Putin from seizing Ukraine? Did we send weapons to the Crimea? I mean, Crimea. Did I say Ukraine?
Crimea. Okay, I understand what you're saying. Yeah, and the context has shifted. And let me just add one aspect of the way in which the context has shifted. And I want to say this is perhaps the first fully social media war, right? And so the fact that we're seeing the barbarity on the ground, that the people look like the people Hollywood shows us all the time. They're white and they're blonde and they are suffering terribly, has created this contagion of sympathy for the Ukrainians that in many ways is sweeping, I think, some of the political leaders along to just keep finding new things they can do to punish the Russians. And it's very hard to get the Republicans and Democrats to agree on anything today, right? And here they are in complete lockstep on continuously escalating the way in which they punish the Russians. And I do think these economic sanctions are the basic equivalent of indiscriminate warfare, because they punish the poorest people in Russia. They hit everywhere, and they are going to do deep damage to the Russian economy. They're already doing deep damage to the Russian economy.
I agree with you. And you have to ask questions about, economic sanctions are always very tricky, right? I mean, one of the ideas is that you make people suffer so they'll rise up and depose their leader. It's not going to happen in Russia. And what's happening in Russia is that ordinary people are suffering. And, we can say they're responsible too. It's their country and they're not doing anything about it. We can say that. But we say that from the comfort of our Zoom meeting.
Yeah, and I, I mean, this is a whole other conversation, which I don't think we can have today because we've got some questions coming online. But how much do the Russian people understand what's happening?
They don't.
Of a capacity do they have to form their own opinion about this? And they live in a world in which access to independent information is scarce to non-existent, right?
You have to use one of those things. What are they called? I forget. The private,
VPNs, virtual.
Yeah, VPNs. But that means you have to actually want it.
Yeah. And you have, I mean, so it's there on Telegram, apparently, if you want it. But apparently, particularly for the older generation, for the working class, they just watch the state media. That's what I hear.
Well, also don't forget that the Russians have been told, for 105 years that the Westerners are lying.
Right.
That their countries are full of crap, that their countries suck, that they invade other countries, they destroy people, they take slaves, and they're not wrong. Right.
And it's not like we don't have our own viral propaganda lies that a large portion of us are believing. And that's despite the fact that we have a relatively, critical media environment relative to what they have, right?
Well, relative to what they have, it's amazing, but also let's not forget, and I hate to do this. My wife always tells me not to do this because it makes it sound like I'm supporting Russia, but I'm not. The United States bombed the capital of a sovereign country, Yugoslavia. We hit cities, we hit hospitals, we hit schools. And the purpose of that bombing was to overthrow the government of Yugoslavia, kidnap its president, and put him on trial in The Hague. Now, we did it on the side of the angels, you could say. but we did it.
Yeah, yeah. Sophia, do you want to come at us with some questions from online? Okay, here we go, Andy.
Yeah, some of the questions Andy already answered, which is like initially we had one which was, when did this start? Which I think you gave a very good, there was like a good session. Then the
8th
second
century.
was, it was like a long time ago. I didn't know, it was like really long. And how did it start? Then it's, what can we do to stop it? And should we try to stop it? And then one follow-up question later on came when you were speaking was, is Putin lying to his neighbors, his citizens? And the one of very important question is, will this lead to World War III?
So let me highlight two questions from those questions.
Yes.
What, if anything, can we do to create an exit ramp, right? And that's one question. And I think the natural flip side of that question is, what is the danger of escalation in this conflict?
I think the danger of escalation is uncalculable. It's huge. You know, if Poland gets involved, if, you know, God forbid Sweden. I don't know why Sweden. Who cares about Sweden? But if, you know, I think the danger is really high. And I keep hoping that there are two beady-eyed SOBs, one in Moscow and one in Washington, who are going to come up with a Cuban Missile Crisis exit from this nightmare. And what happened there was no agreement was reached, right? Khrushchev withdrew his missiles. And then 5 years later, the United States got rid of the weapons in Turkey that Khrushchev was pissed off about, right? We need some kind of a solution. And at this point, it is very difficult for me, and I'm not a statesman, obviously, to imagine a solution that does not include territorial concessions by Ukraine.
And I think Ukraine is willing to make those concessions in the short term to end the war, right?
Well, only if Russia withdraws entirely from Ukrainian territory.
Right. But that involves, right, perhaps ceding the Donbass or portions of eastern Ukraine, at least currently, to...
Right. That's what it seems like he wants, right? And I think he would accept that kind of thing, but I don't know if Zelensky will, right? Zelensky is constantly escalating, which if I were in his place, I'd do it too.
Yeah.
You know, the man is charismatic. Let's not forget he's an actor. He knows how to do this. You know, he's really good at it. And the West has adopted him as a pure hero.
He's Churchillian in the age of social media, right?
I mean, it's unbelievable, right? And let's not forget that all of these people have feet of clay. So, you know, we don't know what Putin's problems are. I mean, Zelensky's problems are. We'll find out. 5 years from now, we may hate Zelensky. I've got no idea. But that's also irrelevant. But I worry that Zelensky wants to fight to the death. If he wants to fight to the death, it's going to escalate.
So I have.
How will this impact the arms race? Will we all need guns?
So arms race, guns. Let me just point out for a second something about the de-escalation idea. You concentrated on Zelensky and what he's willing to accept, and I do think he sends mixed messages.
Right.
But that he's got to, I assume, ultimately want out of this conflict, right? I mean, it's been awful for the people of Ukraine. Having said that, I think the other aspect of this is that the US, NATO needs to give a little bit of a carrot, right. To Putin. You know, these sanctions are not forever. And we're not saying anything like that, right? And these sanctions are crippling in terms of access to technology, access to foreign goods. I've got a slide on this of the thousands of companies that are stopping doing business in Russia, many of which are integral to Russian oil exploration, other aspects of technology development. Even Russian military technology is going to be eventually impacted by the unwillingness of tech companies to do business with Russia, right? So saying also to Putin, get out of there quick, and some of this can be rolled back, right? It seems to me would be really important.
I think that's extremely well said. I think the message that's coming from the West right now, subliminally, directly, whatever it is this is not just about Ukraine. We want you to die.
And please note that we were all talking about May 9th, May 9th, May 9th, May 9th, right? You know, when the Russians celebrate the anniversary of the victory in Europe, and Putin needed a victory by then, right? He was going to launch a nuke into the Black Sea to scare the Ukrainians. None of it happened, right? So I do think one of the things that we're seeing is, you know, as awful as the aggression is, it's also, in some sense, being met by restraint in Putin's calculus or the Kremlin somewhere.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Russia wants to be taken seriously. It always has. And we don't take it seriously. And, you know, the more we say that it's not enough for Ukraine to be independent, we also have to undermine the Russian Empire, whatever the rest of that is, it pushes them farther away from agreement. And it's not about what they say in public. You know, Biden is constantly firing his mouth off. The thing about China was hilarious, by the way. That's always been our policy. Our policy has always been that we'll go to nuclear war to stop China from taking Taiwan. That's always been our policy.
Right.
He just said it, you know, and there was a famous person who said that the definition of a gaffe is when a politician accidentally tells the truth.
Yeah.
Right? And, you know, the coverage of the May 9th thing was staggering to me. All of these, you know, news organizations in the West were talking about this shocking militaristic display in Red Square. They've been doing that since 1945.
Yeah.
There was nothing different about this year's May 9th celebration in Russia.
So the question about escalation and arms race, my thinking on this is that if there really is rearmament, right? And you know, note how much the US already spends on its military. Note that the Russians have probably put maybe even a higher portion of their GDP into what now appears to be a totally dysfunctional military. What we've really got to look at is Germany remilitarizing,
right?
Sweden, Finland joining NATO, that it's these other seemingly peripheral pieces in the expansion of NATO and the remilitarization of NATO that to my mind would be the immediate short-term arms race dimension to this.
Also, it's been a bonanza for the makers of conventional weapons.
So the question coming again here is war good for the economy? Is war good for inflation? This
not for you and me, but it's great for the 1%.
Yeah, it's great for people who own stocks and the people in the companies that are providing the weapons.
Yeah, and the people who make the guns and, you know, all the rest of this. By the way, you said something really interesting before that I had not thought of, that one of the signposts that he was waiting for was Angela Merkel to retire.
Yeah.
That was a miscalculation.
Yeah.
Because it turned out that her nebbish replacement was the toughest leader in Europe. He has led the European response to Russia.
And there's, I think if I've got it right, fracturing within Germany over the question of actual rearmament. But
yes, it's a huge dispute in Germany. You know, last time Germany was a military power, things did not go well.
Will Biden run again? Should there be an age limit to becoming president?
Well, that's not directly on point, but I bet Andy has something to say.
I think it is for Andy, meant for Andy.
Could he run again?
Yeah.
No, it's not really for me to say. I mean, you know, he's going to be a lot older. Things are tough. I think he had hoped that Kamala Harris would be farther along than she is as a potential replacement. She hasn't exactly shown the way some of us had hoped she would in this administration. I'm very leery about putting limits on public elected offices. I don't support term limits. They're placed generally by referendum, and in referenda about 4% of the population participates. So I'm not all that high on it. So I guess my answer would be no. Also, it'd have to be done under constitutional amendment. And the only way to really do a constitutional amendment right now is to have a constitutional convention, and every lunatic in America is going to go to that thing. So no, thank you. my answer to that is no, there should not be an age limit. I think he will run if he thinks he can win. If not, he'll bow out. Is that helpful?
Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us on this today.
I love this.
I didn't even mention Andy's not feeling 100%. He just got a booster for COVID. So thank you for mustering the will and the strength to still get up and talk cogently about all these complicated affairs. Let me just say two things now, pivoting back to this platform. The one is that I hope you enjoyed Andy Rosenthal, and that I think he's going to be joining us maybe to do a class on anti-Black racism in American journalism in the not too distant future. And so keep an eye out for that. And also to let you know that I'm going to be doing something on global climate change this summer, a course on, quote, a world on fire. So more to come, but what a wonderful way to get this started. Thank you so much, Andy, for being with us today.
Thank
you for having me. And thank you to everybody who joined.
All right. Good Memorial Day weekends, everybody. No, it's still a week away, but eyes on the prize. It's coming up. Thank you.
Bye.